If you've come across this video because you've suffered a painful loss of somebody that you care about, then the first thing I want to say is I'm really sorry. Grief is one of the hardest things that we as humans have to bear. And even though it's something that we know is going to happen in our lives for certainty, we are absolutely sure that we are going to lose somebody that we love. It doesn't make it any easier. It doesn't make us any more prepared when it actually happens. Grief is like an earthquake. It's like a tsunami. It's like a major accident. But instead of leaving you with like a huge hole in the ground or torn down buildings or broken bones, there's no visible evidence of the pain and injury that you have suffered in your heart. I'm Karen Andrews. I'm a clinical psychologist, and my mission is to bring mental health into everyone's home. I want to make the things that I know and that I work with my clients more accessible to anyone who can use them. In this video, I'm going to talk about the 5 stages of grief that you may well have heard about, but not know that much about. And hopefully my explanation will help you in terms of processing and making sense of your pain and loss. I want to start off by talking a little bit about the experience of grief itself. Everyone experiences grief differently according to their unique perspective and the way that they see and understand the world. So your experience of grief might not fit into any neat category. The discussion about grief doesn't only refer to the loss of a person. It can refer to the loss of all kinds of things. We grieve the loss of a pet. We grieve a breakup. Sometimes we grieve when we move to a different country or when some kind of big change happens. We can also be overcome with grief when maybe if you find out that you have some kind of illness or disease, or that you've been left disabled in some way after a car crash, you may recognize the stages of grief and the experience of grief that I'm talking about. There are some common themes in the experience of grief. Grief is often tearing. It feels like it's going to tear you apart. It squeezes your heart, and it sits like an elephant on your chest. It takes away your appetite. It takes away your joy. The whole world may lose its color for you. You may not be able to concentrate. You may not be able to think straight or make decisions in the midst of grief. Maybe for you, your grief forms a kind of bubble around you that traps you inside of it and separates you from the rest of the world, so that you feel almost like you're communicating through a wall of glass. Nothing feels real. Maybe at other times it feels all too real, and you cannot separate yourself from the emotions that are just coursing through you. Maybe for you it feels like it takes all the color away. Maybe even your legs hurt and you find it hard to walk, as if your legs are heavy and filled with lead. Maybe you want to die too. All of these are normal responses to grief, and if this is your experience, know that that's okay. Maybe for you, you can't stop crying. Maybe it feels like your tears are just a fountain that will never ever run dry. Or maybe for you, you can't cry. Maybe you're absolutely numb. Maybe you feel completely cut off from your own pain. You're aware of it, but even though you long to cry, you long for the release of crying, all the pain like kind of balls up inside you and you can't let it out. Maybe you don't feel anything. Maybe you just feel numb and flat. You don't feel anything in particular at all. Whatever you feel, acknowledge your feelings. You will grieve your way. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. Grief is a universal human experience, but each person's experience of grief is as individual as a fingerprint. That's not to say that there aren't themes of grief that are very commonly experienced amongst people who are grieving, and it might be helpful for you to identify with those as well. Your grief might shock other people. You may have been a different person before you went through this grief. Other people might not recognize you now because you're different. Just like a tsunami, just like an earthquake, the landscape of your world has changed. You are not the same person anymore, and you may react to things very differently. You may care about different things now. You might even struggle to recognize yourself. Sometimes you don't want to let the pain go. You're aware that the depth of your pain is a tribute to the person that you lost. And it might feel that letting the hurt go or letting the pain go is letting them go, and you're just not ready to do that. Because if you're hurting, you feel as if they're still part of your reality, and it feels as if they still matter and you haven't let them go. Grief doesn't have an end date. It doesn't have a convenient segment of time after which you'll be okay. I wish I could say that it does, but it doesn't. You will process your grief in your own time, in your own way. People, well-meaning, might say all kinds of things like you need to move on, or life goes on, or whatever kind of meaningless platitudes they think might comfort you. Possibly they do mean really well, but those kinds of statements are often the opposite of comforting. Grief is like a journey. It's important to give yourself permission to travel along this journey at your own pace and in your own time. If you're finding this video useful, then please click the like and subscribe buttons. It's really helpful for the algorithm, and it helps to support me to make more videos like this one. So let's talk about the stages of grief, the so-called 5 stages of grief. These are denial, bargaining, anger, and between the anger and the bargaining is a fair amount of guilt, sadness or depression, and finally acceptance. But I want to explain to you that these stages are not discrete things with a beginning and an end that you are going to move through in an orderly way at an orderly pace. No. These 5 stages of grief are useful only if you understand them as occurring in waves. I want you to think about a stormy sea. In the stormy sea, the waves of grief rise up and they fall. Sometimes they're huge waves. Sometimes they're little waves. Either way, each wave may be intensely painful for you. In terms of these stages of grief, the first stage is the stage of denial. Denial is often the thing that triggers the wave of grief. For example, you might pick up the phone to phone the person that you love. You might lean over to touch them in bed. You might remember an appointment that you need to make for them or with them. That is because you have not actually yet processed that they're gone. And it is that denial, when the realization hits you that they're gone, that they're not here, that they're not ever going to be here again, that is when the wave is triggered and it begins to build. As the momentum of the wave rises, it moves from denial into bargaining. And when I say bargaining, I mean those kinds of if only thoughts. If only I had told them I love them more. If only I had been more patient, if only I had been kinder, if only I hadn't been so strict with my child, if only I hadn't done whatever you think you should have done. Or sometimes it's if only I had done more, if only I had done more of this and more of that. Sometimes you might even think, if only I had been the one who was taken, if only I could give up my life in exchange for theirs, I would happily do so. These bargaining thoughts are very common to the experience of grief, and they kind of rise up in the wave of grief. Along with the bargaining thoughts often comes a huge amount of guilt as you process the fact that you were not perfect. Of course you weren't. Nobody is. But when you're grieving, you tend to be really hard on yourself. And the guilt is, in a weird way, it can be something that you can suffer, that you can take on. Guilt is an incredibly common part of bargaining and an incredibly common part of the whole grief experience. So as the wave rises, it goes from denial through bargaining to the top of the wave, and at the top of the wave is generally anger. So much anger. You might be angry at yourself for the things you did do or the things you didn't do. You might be angry at the person who is gone because they left you, or because they didn't take care of themselves, or because they put themselves in the way of injury, if that was what happened, or if there was something that they could maybe have done or not have done. You might be angry at other members of your family. You might be angry at your partner. You might be angry at the world. You might be angry at God if you're a religious person. You might be angry at anything, and you might be angry at everything. Anger is another very common part of the experience of loss. And for me, anger is the thing at the top of the wave. And as the anger rises, the wave breaks into an incredible crash of sadness and depression. And it is at this point that you wonder if there is any point to anything at all. And this is the point of the wave at which you might cry or just feel utterly grief-stricken and hopeless and sad and lost. Generally, if you acknowledge and allow yourself to feel these feelings, the wave will gradually slow down. It will begin to calm, and you will find yourself in a place of acceptance, even if temporarily. And that place of acceptance kind of lasts until the next wave. Maybe you come to some kind of understanding within yourself, even just some kind of realization that this is the way it is and it's not going to change. And somehow you find it within you to carry on. Those are the spaces between the waves. And those spaces actually tend to get longer and longer as you heal. You see, the thing is, the waves of grief tend to come really close together. They come one after another in the first stages, the first period of grief, which can last anything from a few days to a few weeks to a few months, or even longer for some people. The grief comes, the waves of grief come quickly, one after the other, and it feels like you're drowning. It feels like they're attacking you. It feels like you barely have a moment to breathe before the next wave is crashing upon your head. But over time, the waves do get further and further apart. They may not get any less intense when they do hit you, but they do tend to get further and further apart. The research suggests that the first year is often the hardest. And that is because there are so many triggers. There are so many reminders. There's Christmas and birthdays and anniversaries and special times and events when they should have been here or when they should have been doing something with you. And that first year may be very hard to bear. If you have found this video useful in any way, perhaps it has helped you as you're going through a loss of your own, or perhaps you're watching this in order to help support someone who's going through grief themselves, then please let me know in the comments. If you have a question about grief, or if you have any question that you'd like me as a clinical psychologist to answer, then please let me know in the comments and I'll make a video to answer your question.